what you see to the right is a Gambeson I've made myself a while ago, which is the example of a 14th century Gambeson with the typical pigeon breast, so to speak. Let's get cracking. So before we go into the making a 14th century Gambeson, etc., I thought let's first start with why would you actually want to make a Gambeson? It provides some padding across the upper body, ensuring that everything is covered. There's no naked skin, so to speak, where a shot can land, which can be quite painful. It absorbs quite effectively, not maybe the nicest thing to say, but it's really helpful when fighting. You can take it off, breathe in, and you're pretty much okay. And of course, it looks nice. We all want to look like a medieval warrior, and the cloth parts are also part of it. As shown earlier today by Nicholas, quite a few from, let's say, the 11th century onward use gambesons in various thicknesses. Also, why would you want to make it yourself? Let's be fair, a gambeson won't last forever, especially if you've got some metal bits. For example, I've got my breastplate, which causes for a little bit of abrasion, and it will just go through the gambeson in the end. So you can, if you do it yourself, you can make a new one quite easily, and it fits. Can adjust, make the materials, etc. And that's also the second thing why you would want to make it yourself. From my perspective, you can actually have a better control of what materials you want to use. Because what you sometimes see in commercially available gambesons, it's that either the padding is of a material which is less than ideal, or for example, the outer material in a material, but mostly the outer material is a little bit too flimsy, or not nice enough, whatever makes you fancy. And so that's really the reasons to do it yourself. You can repeat it, adjust it where needed, get it to fit for you specifically, and you can ensure that all the materials used are the best materials you want. But of course, it's also quite a lot of work, and that would be a reason not to do it yourself. It takes a lot of time. It does take skill, a couple iterations before you're there, and especially that startup and that learning curve means it's not per se cheaper. I think in material-wise, you can spend like 120 euros on a Gambeson easily. And for, let's say, 1.5, realistically twice as much, you can buy it off the rack. So that's a little bit the thoughts. I've put in a couple links of a couple typical shops if you want to, buy it. But I'm assuming everybody wants to make one, so let's get cracking. So what's the background of specifically 14th century Gambeson? As you can see here to the right, that's an extant pourpoint, and it's based on Charles de Blois. That's a 14th century French guy who became holy after his death in 1364, and as an artifact they kept his doublet, his pourpoint. And this particular garment is civilian. That you can deduct it from a couple things. It's fabric usage, it's the buttons, and the lacing application where you can put the points to attach hosen to, all indicate that this is most likely a civilian garment. Also in manuscripts of the time, illuminations, you see this typically also being worn as a standalone garment, or as a undergarment where you also have a robe on top. But that being said, the pattern is very well usable for a Gambeson. A Gambeson, as Agnes explained earlier today, as being a padded garment for underneath or underneath your armor or standalone defense. And we'll go later in it today to show, this pattern can probably be used also for a Gambeson in all reality and still be historically accurate. On a side note, which is something which comes up quite often, originally everybody thought, this must be an army garment because it says 4 points, and that means 4 points, so something to hang off on, to hang things off of. That's not really what proper means. Later on, especially also with the Lendenier translations, it became quite obvious that there's a profession, which are the volunteers, and they make gilded garments. Gambesons, but everything gilded is what they do. So that's effectively what they do. It only means gilded. So this is. So let's continue on the original garment to get a little bit of a feel for how it looks like, how the pieces fit together, and how it's created. So here we've got the inside of the original garment. As you can see, there's some white linen, not the nice satin silk on the outside, the brocade silk on the outside, and the edges are folded over and stitched down, because you can still see here the outer material. You can see here you can see the outer material. So what they did is they attached the two pieces, folded the outside in and stitched it down. And that's also the method I would recommend normally creating it. Also interesting is you've got here at the bottom, you've got 7 points which are attached to the inside of the doublet, which is to keep up your hosen. And the fact that you've got 7, including one in the middle, suggests that by 13, 16 onwards, you should be looking at, if you're upper class, at split or combined hosen also to be wearing. So just to say that what you often see in this SCA 14th century is people with their underwear showing. In principle, you should just always, as in modern days, aim to not be showing your underwear unless you're a gangster. Just taking a quick sip. Okay, so also looking at the, can I remove this again? Okay. So looking at the original continuing here, you've got to see it flat without the dress form underneath it, because as you saw in the early one, the dress form, it looks very nicely, very shaped. But if you look at the actual pieces just hanging, it's very flat. There's no pre-shaping, so pad stitching, which you see in modern suit jackets, where you already have a lot of the shaping in the garment itself, most likely wasn't applied when doing this. Also, as you can see from the folds, it's not very thick. It looks thicker than it is. So it's a lightly quilted Gambeson, so relatively thin, unsupported. And what especially is nice from this picture is that you can see the cut on the front of the pattern. And what you can see, it's very flat at the top, and then it bends inward just below the rib cage, and then it's flat again. And that's very important. Also, for combat purposes, a very nice feature on this garment is the pre-bent elbows. So the elbows are stitched in such a manner that they already are bent as the default position, which means that if you bend your elbow arm, that you don't have all the material bunching up on the inside of the elbow. A very good feature on a Gambeson, and especially if you go for a little bit thicker. Just to show a little bit on how the pattern looks like. Here you've got the pieces, so you've got the front pieces, which you can see from before. You've got something additionally in the side. Not every pattern has this. This is most likely being added in the original to make up for lack of enough, make optimal use of the fabric. That's also why they've got some pieces here, and you've got a couple pieces here which you don't necessarily need. This underarm can be pretty much in one piece. You see also that in commercially available patterns that's just one piece. And here at the top, You could make, you could make it out of one piece with 2 inserts, but especially this has some added benefit of being able to tweak how it fits underneath your arm in your armpit. It looks very complicated, but I just wanted to show this to give everybody a little bit of feel for, okay, so how would the pattern look like? But if you go down into it, it's pretty easy. Front piece, 2 back pieces, upper arm, underarm. That's pretty much it. So then the question is, okay, we've looked at the garment itself, how it's constructed, how thick it is, how it's shaped. We look at it and go like, oh, that's pretty nice for a Gambeson, but is it appropriate as a Gambeson? I would say yes. And why would I say yes? You can look at a lot of manuscripts and illuminations, and I've picked out a couple where you can clearly see people taking off their armor and showing a pigeon-breasted Gambeson shape, which is pretty much in line with the Charles de Bois. And what you can see is already in this picture to the left, bottom left, and you can see different stitching patterns. So there's not one set way of stitching it, and that's also a little bit where you can have fun with the Gambeson. So looking at the artwork from the time, I would say, such a garment is pretty much appropriate. So let's look at the design and aesthetic consideration. So first off, before you start off on wanting to make it, really determine what's the use and purpose going to be. That means first choice is, of course, is it going to be for court wear or is it going to be to fight in? Let's assume it's going to be fight in. Then you need to get a bit of an idea of, okay, how much of a standalone defense is this going to be? Or will I be pretty much encased in metal like a late 14th century English knight? In that case, I can go a little bit thicker. So standalone, very thick. Just a little bit of padding to ensure that my armor doesn't bite. That's relatively thin. You can, especially if you've got proper steel armor, you don't need a lot of padding. Now, what's the benefit of making the Gambeson? You can vary the thickness in areas. And that's especially interesting in the following areas, which is the hip area, where you might want to have some additional padding, especially on the hip bone. And that applies for I think, almost everybody. And you can do, for example, a lot thinner on the forearms because you don't really need a lot of bulk there. And if you get hit there, generally your arms move away, so you don't need that much padding. But here on the top of the shoulder, you do want to have some additional padding, or you might want to have some additional padding. It's all up to you. Being fair, for a close approximation of the Charles de Bois Gambeson Papa, you need to be in shape. I think the original owner was quite thin, but with a large upper chest, upper torso. He was also known to do a lot of abstaining from food for quite some time, so that's also part of him being holy. So he was thin and athletic. And if you want to pull off that shape, you need to be at least a little bit of an athletic body shape. But for a functional Gambeson, you need to be aware it doesn't have to fit close everywhere. What you want to have is that in the arms, it needs to be comfortable, that you can lift your arm, move your arm forward, backward. With this type of sleeve, if you do it correctly, you're not going to pull up the rest of the Gambeson too much. And if you're not going to hang your legs off it, it doesn't have to be tight at the bottom. So you can easily get away with a little bit more room on the torso without detracting from the functionality of the Gambeson for SCA fighting, but you won't have the same shaping exactly. That's it at the end of the day. Just a little bit of a tidbit on the side. When I made this originally, I had decided to also hang my leg armor off it and my hosen. That's also why I needed it to be relatively tight. In the end, I've moved away from it and moved over to a vest. I'm considering to move over to a lendenier. Why? Because, at the end of the fighting, you want to take your gambeson off, and then you also need to take your leg armor and your hosen off, and then you're standing there in your underwear. So I don't advise it, only use it to attach or point your arm armor on, your shoulder armor, and anything on the torso wear on top of it. I wouldn't attach it to your hosen or leg armor. Yeah, and another fun story is, if you need to squeeze in a little bit in the middle, that's not the end of the world. It helps a little bit with the shaping. And there are descriptions from the late 14th century about, knights with not the exact athletic body shape, which still try to squeeze themselves into their armor, not always to the best effect. So it's of all times, I would say. So how to get the desired shape of the garment? There's been a lot of talk, especially when I first started making gambesons. There was a lot of stuff on the internet about using, towels and put it in your chest or put some additional padding in on that spot. And it's still an option. You can pad it out to get a padded pigeon look chest. But from my experience, you can get the exact look from the manuscripts without any heavy padding in the chest. And if you look back at the original, it's not really heavily padded in the chest and still create that pigeon vest shape, so to speak. And how do you get that shape? What do you need to do? It's very important that the top side of the pattern is flat, but that it lies on the chest muscles, which run off a little bit in this direction, as you can see on the top arrow. And then what you need to do is pinch it in and make it really tight just below the rib cage. And what it does, it lifts up effectively. Then in the middle, around your midriff, you get this bulge, which is the pigeon vest you're looking for. And when I describe it as such, it sounds a little bit like you're putting yourself in a corset. To an extent, it's true. But if you do that, then you've got this shaping, which you're looking for to get. Questions so far? Just shout. I can't see the chat, so just give it a shout. So my starting point has been two commercial available patterns, and I've made several gambesons, both from Reconstructing History and from Tasha's Code Simple. And if you want to go and make this gambeson, I would suggest that you buy this pattern as the starting point, because it makes life so much easier than starting from the picture I showed before and then try and size it up to you, especially if you haven't done it before. So let's cover the available patterns, their pros and their cons. So on Reconstructing History, they're currently based in the Netherlands, by the way, and they've got this pattern. And the big pro is that I really like how they shape the breast area. It's very close to the original. And the arm sieves, so the cutout for the arms are very deep, even, so the arms fit very nicely into it. Yeah, but that being said, there are some definite cons, which is the measurements are off. I don't know what they've used to create their sizing on the pattern. But if you measure, so I've got a 42-inch chest. First time around, I drew out the pattern, 42-inch chest, put it on, and I've got like 6 inches of additional material left, 15 centimeters. And that's less than ideal because it needs to fit you pretty close, and that was just way too much. So what you need to do is you need to take your measurements and then see on the pattern which should I pick, and if you've got a couple different ones, then you can just draw them together to make it suit you. So that's you can't simply go 42-inch chest, 42-inch pattern, and I'm done. That's not going to work. You need to measure everything, check everything twice, and then pick what works best. Also, the pieces don't fit out of the box, so need tweaking. There are a couple pieces which are longer than the pieces they are joined to, and it's not because you need to put some extra material in to get some shaping. So that's just something to be mindful of. When you're putting everything together, that you need to cut something off, maybe left or right. Nothing massive, but you need to be aware of it and realize it's not you. It's just the pattern is a little bit funky. And the neck opening is too wide. It really comes down to here instead of being nice close against the neck opening. I must say, with every pattern I've bought from the US, it also applies to the one from Code Simple, all the neck openings are very, very wide. So I think it might be a American clothing style thing. Might be so. But you need to close it up a little bit. So reconstructing history, what you get out of it is very nice, but it needs some work. Then we've got Tasha Code Simple. The pros are pieces fit out of the box. Here you can go 42-inch, 42-inch, and everything fits together as it should. Everything goes together, but it's it's a good fit for slightly less athletic builds. There's a little bit less difference between chest and waist, and there's less, and the hips are relatively wide compared to the chest. So possibly also for female fighters, this might be an interesting pattern to go for, because you've got a little bit more hip space even in standard pattern to work from. So what are the cons? From my perspective as a man, wide hips in the standard pattern. You don't really have a puffy chest. What do I mean with it? As I said with the other one, you really get the pigeon dress because it cinches in just below the rib cage, and then you've got that swoop. With this one, you've got a slightly bulge in the top of the chest here between the chest muscles, which is a slightly different look. And if I would put a date to it, I would say it's more like 1350s, than 1370s, 1380s look-wise. So it doesn't give you that puffy chest. But that's a bit of the drawback on that one. And again, the neck is way too wide, and you need to add at least an inch everywhere to get it closer to your neck. So materials. First, I'll cover the padding materials. So we've got a couple one. The first one is what you often see and buy. That's polyester, polyfill. I used it in my first Gambeson, and avoid at all costs. That's very important you're just going to sweat to death in it, and it's not really going to pad anything. Another option is, as you can see here, I've got a wool blanket. These are 100% wool blankets, military issue. You can buy them in the military dumps. They used to be $17.50 for a blanket, which is more than enough for a Gambeson and other padding. Unfortunately, with all the terrorists running around, it's a little bit more difficult to get military surplus. So they're now in the range of 30-35 euros for a blanket. This is my preferred go-to material. It's nice and thick, so let's say 5 to 6 millimeters, but it's not too thick. And it being wool, it absorbs sweat very effectively. And what it also doesn't do is get funky, because wool is a little bit antibacterial, so you generally don't get smells in your Gambeson. Another type of material you can use, I hope you can see it, is this kind of wool padding, and it's usually used for quilting, blankets. It's really soft, so it doesn't really do anything. Doesn't do any much, but it is nice if you want to, for example, pad out the chest area. And that's what I would suggest to use it for. This is relatively expensive material to use. You also often see this kind of cotton padding. As you can see, it's very thin. It's like, get it in focus, 2-3 millimeters thick. And so it's thin. You need quite a few layers of this, which makes it quite expensive. It's pretty doable. Also, the only thing is, because of the material usage, it's relatively expensive. The benefit, I must say, that's also, I suppose, the benefit is this isn't woven material, which means you can stretch it and shape it. So if you want to pre-shape your garment and do pad stitching in there to help with the shaping, you can use a couple of layers of this and a little bit more easily shape it. So those are, from my perspective, the 4 options you've got for padding, and my preferred go-to material is, like I said, is wool blanket type of material. So let's have a look at what are our options for our outer material. So I've got a selection, so to speak, over here. You can have a look at. So I've got cotton, and this is upholstery type fabric. As you can see, it's seen some use for padded creases, padded upper legs. Again, as you can see, it's the same wool blanket. This is cotton, upholstery type. I bought it in the sale. And as you can see, because it's tightly woven and quite heavy material, it really stands the test of time. And so try and find I'll just see if I can get it into focus, a nice, tightly woven fabric. And so this is cotton. It's also appropriate for the time. Here I've got 10th weight cotton. This is very heavy material. As you can see, again, it's very tightly woven. But this is too stiff. If you do, you can see it. It almost stands on itself. So go for something, again, depending a little bit on your purpose. But if you want something which lasts a bit longer, I would go with something which is tightly woven, but still flexible. Here you've got a material I really, really like. This is linen, 10th cloth. As you can see, it's very thick. Hopefully you can see it on the screen, but it's very, very light, very flexible. But still, as you can see, it's got the same very tight weave. So this is a very nice material to make gambesons out of, and I would always try to find something like this in the market store. The only drawback is you can only find it in white. So if you want to go a little bit more fancy, go for a little bit more colors, you can use for the outer material also silk. There is even a manuscript from the 15th century, which says that a Gambeson doublet should be, covered on the inside with satin, so not linen, but satin. Haven't done it myself ever, but I've got a helmet padding in the making, and I'm going to see if that's really that much more comfortable. You can get this in any color you like, but of course it's quite expensive. Especially if you plan on putting it on a Gambeson which goes under armor, I would not go for it. And the last option is also linen, but more. So this is fabric store material, and here I've got something from the IKEA. You can get this in any color you like. Go for some quite heavy, again, upholstery weight. It's flexible. It's got the benefit also of being a little bit stretchy, which means that if it's tight, you can, especially if you change weight, so to speak, shape a little bit, that you can get away with it with this material. If you go for the material I shown before, this is unforgiving. It needs to fit, and if it doesn't fit, then you need to adjust, and because the Gambeson won't. But with this material, with the linen heavy, there is still some room to do so. And the only drawback is it's slightly less hard wearing than the other material, because it's a little bit thinner and it's a little bit less tightly woven. But you can get it in any color you like, which is always a big boon.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to make the point, and that when you said that stay away from polyester at all costs, yes, do not stuff your Gambeson with polyester. There was an incident at Double Wharf a couple of years ago when there was an unfortunate young gentleman who had a polyester filling in his Gambeson. It was quite a warm day. It was quite a humid day. He passed out on the field, and it could have been pretty nasty. So don't do that thing.
Yeah, really stay away. And that's also a little bit, when you buy your Gambeson, be sure that you know what the material is they're going to use for the padding. That's very important. Question from John, should we pre-wash the fabric before starting the Gambeson? I would definitely say yes, and also do it hot. Yeah, and everything. So that also means, for example, if you use the quilting, the padding material, also wash the padding material. Because else I made a couple loaner gear Gambesons, and I thought I had washed also the padding, and I didn't, and they all shrank to a size smaller. Not the end of the world if they're big enough-ish, but especially if you've got the heavy upholstery weight material, you don't want to shrink it a size. So really pre-wash, maybe even do a double, a little bit warm, so that it's solid and isn't gonna move anywhere anymore. But don't wash too hot when you do wash it once in a while. Yeah. Any other questions I ignored because I couldn't hear it?
I was going to say, well, I've made a couple, and I normally use 5 layers of the thin quilting material, which actually starts off quite bulky, but after a year or so, it's kind of packed down to the and I think to be actually more like the wool blankets. That's a really good top tip. Thank you. I'll see if I can find some wool blankets for my next one.
Yeah, no, and also. Personally, I also found the material to be relatively expensive. I don't know how you saw it, but I think a blanket size is something like 30 euros. And as you are already saying, you need 5 layers or something, then it adds up quite rapidly, especially compared with the wool blanket, which is the thickness you want almost from the get-go. Sometimes you can. My advice is buy used blankets from the army store, from the surplus store, because they already been washed and mishandled by the military. So the chances of shrinking and thinning down with time is a lot smaller, and they tend to be cheaper. So it's win-win. So thinner cloth possible when armor allows it. What do I mean with it? I'll just pick it up 1 second. So this is the Gambeson I showed in the picture before. And I've got a breastplate which I wear with this. I need to wear also my male hauberk, which is a male vest, so to speak, on top of it. But especially with fighter practice, I ignore it because it's heavy, and why do I need it? It's for looks anyway. But what you then have is that the breastplate digs in here on the sides and in the armpit. It's not the end of the world, I would say, after 10 years of use, and you can sort of patch it up. But especially if you've got armor where you're going to rub and you're not going to use chainmail to ensure that rubbing won't tear up the Gambeson, go for a little bit heavier material. If you don't have that rubbing effect, especially at the corners, or you've got mail to wear on top of it, you can go for a little bit fancier. But be aware that if you're going to wear chainmail, everything is going to be black, pretty much at the end of it, after a couple wears. Really important is that it's pliable. You don't want it to have it too stiff. This is effectively covered the batting. So taking measurements and creating the pattern. What goes where? What measures do you need? Here we go back to the original, very complicated pattern. And what you can see is that it's you need to add a couple pieces to be able to determine whether or not what the sizing is you're going to pick out on the pattern. For example, G, that's the circumference of your chest, just, let's say, not just below your arms, but let's say this bit below your arms. So it's here, just at the level of your nipples, so to speak. And that needs to correspond. So that's circumference. Plus 6 centimeters, I always add for some padding, is the circumference which I need from the G's added up, and of course the front piece and the side piece again. And so you need 2 times the front and the side piece measurement plus the back piece needs to add up to the circumference plus 6 centimeters and minus the seam allowance, because every piece which connects creates a seam allowance. So you've got, in this case, let's also go through how I need to approach the chest circumference. I've got the front of the garment, which is going to give me 1.5 centimeters extra. Then I've got the side piece, which is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So in total, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 seam allowances for the chest circumference. So that's, you really need to add, 15 centimeters plus 6, 21 centimeters. you easily see how I make a mistake there. This measurement plus 6 centimeters minus 15 centimeters is what your chest circumference should be, and allowing a little bit of extra overlap for the button. Yeah, so you need to do a little bit of math. I don't know if Ida is on the call, but I think from the last workshop she knows that you need to be careful in this stage. You know, it's nothing too difficult. But just be aware that you need to do the front pieces twice and 1 times the back pieces, and they need to take the seam allowance into consideration. And so for H, which is your waist, you do the same thing, and you need to do it at the level, your waist is where your belly button is roughly, so not where we wear our modern pants, which is more on the hips, just over the hips. And again, you need to do the same trick there. And so you take the measurement, add 6 centimeters, and then measure 2 times the front piece is H and 1 times the back piece H, and then subtract 15 centimeters and see if it comes to the same number or not, and allowing for the front closure. Same for the hip, that's also not that complicated. What you can do, and because it's what I would always suggest to make a mock-up. So you've bought the pattern, either Tasha's or Reconstructing History. You do these measurements, check, and you see what fits you. Then always cut a dummy. I tend to use, at the IKEA, they've got some fabric called Beomool, and it's, it's very flimsy cotton, but it's €2 the meter, so it's dirt cheap. And I used to do that. I always use that to make a mock-up, check if everything fits, especially also with the arm pieces, if everything connects correctly before going into the actual cutting all the actual pieces. Be sure that if you cut everything out to the sizes you calculated, then you need to have a little bit of room left because of to account for the padding which is going to go in there. So you need a good solid extra piece of fabric in there. An alternative to do is that you say, you know what, I'm gonna make the mock-up to the sizing without padding, and then once you've got a pattern you're happy with, because the padding is only going to increase the circumference. 1 second. What about you, that's vervelend? Because it's only going to change the circumference. What you can do is make the mock-up to fit you without padding, then lay all the pieces flat and make in every piece 2-3 cuts, and move them, make them a little bit wider so that they've got a space, and then redraw the pattern to account for the padding. That's another alternative you can use. But generally what I do personally is just make a mock-up based on the measurements as described, and just, pinch the fabric to see if I've got enough room to allow for padding, but not too much. Roughly, you need the 6 centimeters of spacing there. If you're still uncertain, you can always allow a little bit of extra material, add it to the side seams, so that once everything is padded and you've got the individual pieces, you can, take them in a little bit at a time till you're comfortable. And that's a very good alternative to get it fitted to you, where you don't need to get it right in one go. Very important, is for the forearms, particularly. If you're right-handed, don't go and measure your left forearm, because the right one being the dominant arm, where you always also hammer with, use power tools with, it's going to be bigger. I found it out. Also, my right is 2-3 centimeters bigger in circumference than my left one. So be mindful that you need to measure your dominant arm, and not use your dominant arm to measure other smaller arm. Yeah. Questions?
Just a quick shout out for the ladies present. Obviously, when you're taking your measurements, wear the sports bra that you intend to wear while you're fighting, so that you get the accurate chest circumference rather than anything else.
Yeah. Thank you.
Got a quick question about forearm fitting and wrist fitting. Because obviously those garments fit very snugly over the wrist. So what's your preferred method for basically making them not too baggy around the wrist? See, because the fit there, you need to unbutton them to get your hands out, don't you? Which is what you need for armor. But
so how to get it tight? That's effectively the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I've done Gambesons with lacing on the forearms, so that you need to pull the string to get it tight, and I've used buttons. I haven't used that you just move your arm through, because then you indeed, as you say, you end up with way too much bulk at the last stretch of the forearm. And why would you want to avoid it? Twofold. One is because if you've got extra bulk here, then that also means that the armor which goes on top is bigger, which doesn't look very nice. So for looks, you want to have a slim forearm, so to speak, especially the last bit. And of course, for your fighting, because if you're going to wear a gauntlet, half gauntlet, doesn't really matter. If this is really big, let's say, this big, then you need a really big gauntlet to move over on top of it. Well, if this is nice and tight, that means that you don't need a huge bell on your half gauntlet to still be able to make these movements. So that's on the question, why do you want to have it tight? My method is just patterning it very tight and using a button closure, which is, in my experience, the best way to, get it nice. I'm not a big fan of the lacing, mostly because it's quite fiddly to do up the lacing, for the last bit while you're wearing it. I find that, buttons, you get this motion going, which it's only the last 4 buttons you're going to undo and do up, which is, I find, a little bit more comfortable, and you don't end up with this piece of string, which you then need to get rid somewhere. So just use, ensure that the pattern is pretty close. Use buttons, which you can also, of course, change the position of a little bit while you're making the Gambeson. Are you going to put it up on the edge, or are you going to put it a little bit more on the inside? So you can win a centimeter easily with playing around with where you place the buttons, and that typically does the trick. Also, and that's what I'm going to show you next, is how I principally construct my Gambesons. That allows you to, once everything is pretty much together, still go back and tweak it a little bit. And generally speaking, smaller is doable, bigger isn't. But yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Oh, I've got another question. Quick. How long do you like to make these? That where
Yeah, so just cover the crotch. So that's just something like 10 centimeters over the hip bone, I would say.
okay, thank you.
That's because that's typical for the late 14th century. I've also got one in progress where I'm going to go for a 1360s Dutch one, which still has a padded pigeon breast, but he's got a Gambeson which almost goes to the knees, which based on my research is something typically Dutch for that time. So feel free. There are instances where you can go longer if you want to do it, but I think typically, and then I'm thinking about France, Germany, UK, so Western Europe, including Italy, it's typical to go like crotch level, just over the crotch for last quarter of the 14th century. So yeah, you've got two techniques on how you can make a Gambeson. And you've got the bag method, I call it, and you've got the layer method. So what do I mean with the bag method? Here I've got, just to show the example, this is a vest I'm working on to hang my hosen and my leg armor off of. It uses pretty much the same pattern as for the Gambeson, but is of course a little bit tighter. I'm sewing up eyelets. But how have I created this? I've stitched everything along the edge, as you can see, and turned it inside out, which means that, getting it into focus, the edges are finished off right away without anything fancy. So you just sew up the pieces, the correct size, the outsides towards each other, stitch it, and then fold it inside out. And then the only thing is where you had something, where you needed to fold it inside out, you've got, of course, a unfinished edge. And what I then do is just turn it inside and stitch over it so that it's finished. So that's the bag method, where you assemble the pieces, as a skin, so to speak, one layer completely, and then stitch it around the sides, fold it inside out, and you're done. I'm not sure how historical this is, but it's very fast and efficient. The other method, which I use, which uses more manual labor, is I'm just going to show my Gambeson. As you can see, I make everything in their individual panels, kilted, and then stitch it together, fold this over on the inside, stitch it down, especially on the edge, because that's where you win with the bag method, is I fold it over and then stitch it by hand. And I like the finishing. What you get with this is because some of the color walks over, so you don't have this edge, which you see when you can use the bag method, especially if you've got different materials for inside and outside, but it is more manual labor to do this method. A bit of a benefit is that you can still tweak a little bit more, but that's pretty much it. Let's zoom out a little bit. So just to give you a little bit of a feel on, okay, so you've got the pieces. How do I go about creating it? This is pretty much straightforward. I've got here the panels, and what I've done is I've layered them. First the inner material, then the blanket, then the outer material. And what I always do is then I stitch just, on the seam allowance distance. I stitch the blanket to the inner fabric around the edge. And I do that for every panel. So what I end up with is the inner fabric with the stitched on blanket around the edge. And then I go back and I simply trim everything off so that when I stitch this together with something else, as you can see here, that I don't end up with blankets in the seam. So I've got blankets where I want it, but I don't have anything in the seam. So that's step one. Stitch the blanket to the inner fabric and trim around the edge and stitch around the seam allowance. Then pin everything and stitch in the quilting. I tend to draw on it with some pencil, as you can see here, and then simply stitch it. What is important to know is that before you start stitching, because a modern sewing machine has a feed at the bottom which transports the material, but especially you can have quite some heavy material in there. What can happen is that the speed of the bottom is higher than of the top. So if you don't pin it, everywhere between where you're going to stitch it, you need to pin it, because else you end up with a Dorito chip. Which you can use if you want to have it for shipping, but in principle, all these panels, also from a historical perspective, what we know and believe to be the practice, these need to be effectively created flat without any additional pre-shipping. So then, as you can see here, sew the pieces together and then fold it over and stitch it down. And then stitch, then continue the stitch line over there so that it's a solid piece which is fully, attached. And then you've got the body.
Just one question. Have you ever considered dyeing the outer? I always thought that dyeing them rust brown was a good investment.
Yeah, I think so. Or grayish, not really black, but that's in all fairness, that was the reason why I made the first one black. Well, not the very first one. I had made a couple of Gambesons before that, but the first of this type, black, because it being black, it doesn't look as smooched up as what you've got with white, because you see everything on it. You see the blood, the rust, the sweat, the grime. It's gonna look worn and used. Well, if you go for the black, it's gonna look reasonably okay for a long time. The only thing is, I haven't found any pictorial evidence black Gambesons. And at the end of the day, that was for me the reason to stay with this material and this color and not try and dye it or something. But your mileage may vary. So was there anything which that I dropped off, where you can say, can you please repeat?
When you're talking about finishing the padding on the inside and how then that translates to finishing the seams off. Could you just run over that again, please?
Yeah. So I've got here a upper arm, which is still in its individual pieces. So I'll just grab it, and you can see it. And hopefully everybody can recognize. This is from the upper arm, which goes. This is your armpit effectively here, and this is on your back. And this attaches to a big piece over here, which covers your neck area and your chest. And I've got 3 layers. So I've got the inner, which is just a lightweight linen. I've got the wool blanket, and I've got the outer layer. And how do I assemble this? Especially in the arms, I do a couple things. First off, I stitch it around the edge at roughly the seam allowance. I stitch the blanket in onto the inner fabric, and then gently cut everything away so that once I stitch everything together, as you can see here, there's nothing in between, which creates bulk and means that it's difficult to finish. So I've got it stitched to the inside, trimmed and attached. And then this piece goes on top. And what I've done here is I've already stitched these 2 pieces together, and with the iron gone over it and pressed everything flat. Then you put it on top of it. You get the gist, I think, and then pin everything and stitch it across. That's roughly my process. And then you've got, as you can see here with the arms, then you end up with a panel like this. No, on the side, everything is still open. Yeah. But it's stitched together, and now it can be processed into a completed garment.
And your stitching, your quilting stitching goes right edge to edge, doesn't it? It doesn't stop for the seam allowance.
I just go through, you know, especially, and that's also coming back to your question. So if we've got a forearm here, you know, and we're not quite sure whether or not we might want to trim a little bit extra of this, you know, once we've got everything together. What you can then opt to do is, of course, stop it short of the edge. But what I would advise to do is, what I always do when I finish a stitch is go back and forth, just, you know, quickly 2 or 3 times, which means that it doesn't unravel. But if you're not sure on that it's final yet, then I would simply stitch through. Don't go back and forth, just cut off the wire. And then you can always go back, and you've got these small cutters. You know, for example, which you use if you've incorrectly attached everything together, which of course happens to everybody.
A lot.
So those are these. Not sure if everybody's familiar with it. But you can use these to go in and then cut open the seam, or at least the stitching, the quilting, till where you want it to have, and then finish it up again. You know, that also allows you to trim the blanket again on the inside, so that you don't have the bulk. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. That explains it perfectly. Well,
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so you got everything, you stitch the blanket to the inside, you put the outside, you put quilting lines in it. That applies for the forearm, because that's a one piece for the torso, because that's also just, you know, everything is a single piece, and you can assemble these panels. And like I said before, if you're unsure of the sizing, you can always say, you know, I'm gonna stitch it back another centimeter you can use these gussets on the side to play around with it and have some fun. But the upper arms are different and a little bit complicated, and that's why I need to cover it specifically. So, because what happens in the upper arms is that you've got, depending on whether or not you have this pattern here at the side also. Sorry, it needs to be on this side. You can do this out of one integral piece. And then you need to add a gusset, as you can see here, and you need to add a gusset in there. If you make it out of two pieces, then you don't have this gusset to add, but you still have this one in the chest area, which you can't really, not do. So how do I work my way around it? What I do is, this is cut in the same pattern as the rest. And then I go to the slit and take out, the seam allowance up to nothing. I cut away. So I cut away a little bit of a slit out here, and the same on this side, so that I end up with effectively a V shape. And then what I do is I take the gusset and also take the seam allowance, cut it off here and cut it off on this side, and then put it in there. And with a zigzag, attach the blanket to each other. And what allows me to do, which allows me to then put it up back on, on the, well, this is the outer, but on the inner piece, spread it out and stitch everything without having two blanket layers additionally here on these areas. And because else you end up with the additional bulk, and by already cutting away the seam allowance on the gusset and doing the zigzag, you can attach it temporarily, I must say, without any issue. But why is it not really a problem on the longer run is because you're going to put quilting line in here, and that will ensure that the gusset which you've put in here will certainly stay put, isn't going to move anywhere. So that's an important thing to remember. How to insert a gusset is cut the slit, remove the seam allowance on the blanket, and zigzag so that it stays in place. And then do as usual. Yep. So I described the layer method where I stitch the blanket to the inner material. If you use the back method, what you do is you stitch the blanket to the inner material and then the outer material all in one go. Trim again the material only for the outer edges, quite important, and then fold it inside out. But I think, especially if you're beginning, I would suggest the layer method, where you just put everything as a sandwich in panels, assemble the panels, and then do the finishing, which gives you a little bit more flexibility. And I think in the end, although it's a little bit more work, a nicer finish. So this just reiterates what I already said on how to piece everything together, what the sequence is to stitch it together.